Okay, thank you, everybody. Am I coming across loud enough?
Yeah, you're very loud.
Okay, good. Yeah, I normally am. My abject apologies for messing up the time. I tend to do that kind of thing. And I didn't see the messages because I was our toddler is home and feeling poorly today, so I was child minding for until early afternoon. Um, so which is maybe appropriate for the talk. So I'm talking about socialism and bourgeois feminism. Could put bourgeois feminism in inverted commas because there's some controversy about how appropriate that term is. But socialism and bourgeois feminism from Marx and Engels to the Second International. And I'm aware that the issue of feminism, women's rights, questions of sex and gender have come up elsewhere at Communist University. So I may be repeating points that other people have said, and I'll apologize for that, but hopefully there'll be, if there's overlap, there'll also be some distinctions. Okay. And just check people can see the PowerPoint all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So you'll all have heard of Origins of Family, Private Property and the State by Engels, which is a kind of our document when it comes to discussions of sexual division of labour and the origins of patriarchy. And the title itself sums up, I think, the thesis, which is a succession that you have, first of all, the emergence of the family, secondly, the emergence of private property, thirdly, the emergence of the state. And by Engels' argument, one comes out of the other. And as you can also see from the title, he's explicitly and openly drawing upon the work of the American anthropologist Lewis H. Morgan. So the argument that Engels is making following people like Morgan is that the family, as we understand it, 2.4 children and parents, is not something which is natural, that the natural state of human existence was the horde, as it is the term often used, or the gens, basically the gathering of people who are related vaguely by blood, by kinship, and more or less in such a gathering in this prehistoric community, sex is more or less free and easy. Children are raised collectively. That's the argument. Children are raised collectively by the horde, by the gens. The first counter-revolution in prehistory, therefore, is the revolution which gives rise to the family, more or less as we understand it. And this is a revolution, a counter-revolution in which men subjugate women. And that therefore the family is by origins a patriarchal institution where women are subordinated, tied to the mother role, and men go off and enjoy themselves. Friedrich Engels saw this as the world historic defeat of the female sex as being the first counter-revolution. Out of the family emerges the idea of inheritance, your children inheriting, and therefore emerges the idea of private property. Basically, private property in any important sense doesn't exist until you have a sense of children which belong to you, belong to the father. Therefore, private property is passed on to the children. So private property emerges from the family. As private property emerges from the family, there develop institutions to protect that private property. These institutions are armed bodies of men, which crystallize into the form of the state. So we have a succession here. The family comes first, and the family emerges out of a counter-revolution of men against women. Out of the family comes private property. Out of private property comes the state. This argument is not new to Engels. You can actually see it in Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, argued something very similar. Hobbes argued that the natural state of human existence is one of equality, men and women being in the same level, something that Hobbes wasn't very much in favour of because he believed it couldn't give rise to any sort of civilization, and that what breaks humanity out of this low-level equilibrium, as Hobbes would have seen it, was a kind of patriarchal revolution of men imposing themselves upon women, and that all civilization develops, therefore, out of this original act of the establishment of patriarchy in some prehistoric time. Thomas Hobbes saw this as a good thing. Engels sees something very similar. He sees it as a bad thing. In this view, the patriarchy underpins class society, that if you like, the original sin is patriarchy, and that class society is a secondary effect of patriarchy. There's nothing wrong intellectually with this argument. It does raise interesting political questions, some of which have been raised by feminists of various stripes, in which they see patriarchy as being the fundamental problem in society. Therefore, if you want to grasp the radical chains of oppression within society, the radical chains you should be grasping and breaking are not those of class, because they're secondary. The radical chains you should be breaking are those of patriarchy, because they're primary. So there's a certain curiosity which emerges out of the argument that Engels makes, which, so far as we know, Marx largely accepts, is that one could draw the conclusion that the real target should be patriarchy, not class society, class society being secondary in its effects. Now, elsewhere, I have raised some doubts about some of the issues which Engels have raised. Some of the doubts are quite strong, some are more speculative, but I'll raise some of them again now. First of all, fundamentally, the idea that family, in the sense of pair bonding between, broadly speaking, a man and a woman to raise children, the idea of this being something which is emerges out of patriarchal revolution, I'd have quite a lot of doubts about, and most anthropologists now have quite a lot of doubts about. It seems more likely that the family, in the sense of pair bonding based upon sexual and affective attraction for the raising of children, is not something which emerges out of a struggle within society, but rather is has a naturalistic base. That is, it has a basis in how humans naturally organize and associate. The family is not something which is created. The family is something which is innate to human sociability. It's what people do. They form families. Not to say that these are families which are, share every aspect of the family with which we're familiar. There's no pair bonding could include more than two people. Pair bonding probably didn't normally last 40 years of somebody's life, but nonetheless, pair bonding for the raising of children based upon sexual and emotional attraction, I would argue, and anthropologists are largely of this opinion now, is something which is natural to human sociability, not something which emerged from a patriarchal counter-revolution in prehistory. So in that sense, there is no origin of the family in prehistory. Rather, the family is part of what it is to be human. I'd suggest rather more tentatively, and I've talked about this before, I think at a communist university, and certainly in the pages of the Weekly Worker, I've suggested that there's something to be said for the Kautsky argument, which Karl Kautsky makes at length in his materialist conception of history, where Kautsky basically disagrees that private property gives rise to the state. And he says it's, roughly speaking, the other way around, that the state gives rise to private property. The argument being here is that the state is something which emerges when one people conquer another. The argument Kautsky makes is that, broadly speaking, settled agrarian communities are conquered by pastoral communities, and that the conquering community establishes itself as a proto-state apparatus to oppress those they have conquered. And in so doing, they establish a private property initially in people in the form of slavery, but private property also in ownership of the means of production, which primarily in its origins is land. So labor and land is owned by private property through conquest initially, rather than evolving out of a patriarchal counter-revolution. So in this sense, if we are inclined to accept some of these propositions, and we can talk about it more in the discussion, we had come to a conclusion, we can come to a conclusion in which it is not the case that patriarchy gives rise to class division, but rather class division, which emerges from the institution of private property and proto-state institutions, gives rise to patriarchy. In that sense, patriarchy becomes an effect of class society rather than the origins of class society. Now, in kind of elaborating this argument, I'm going to point to somebody who probably doesn't come up very much at communist universities, which is this guy, Robert Trivers. And Trivers wrote in 1971 a very influential article, which advanced the parental investment theory. Trivers is, broadly speaking, one of these evolutionary psychologists, or what is known in the 1970s as the sociobiologists. These tended to be kind of curious people, rather weird people in the 1970s. There's a very famous evolutionary psychologist or sociobiologist, a guy called George R. Price. And Price in the 1970s comes up with an argument to explain altruism. That is, doing good for others without any immediate payback. So Price is very interested in where altruism comes from, because he says altruism does exist. You find it in the animal world and you find it in the human world. How do you explain altruism? Because there doesn't seem to be any obvious evolutionary reason why you should do something for somebody else without getting any payback. And Price worked out that altruism does make sense if you feel you might be related to people even indirectly. If you share some genes in common, by being altruistic, you can propagate the genes you share in common. And therefore, you should expect to find altruism being more strongly in evidence between, let's say, cousins than it is compared to the altruism where you find between second cousins or third cousins or something like that. So fundamentally, Price came up with this argument about altruism is connected to how close you are genetically to the people or if you're an animal, the creatures you've been altruistic towards. Now, I say these are kind of odd people, the sociobiologists, and Price certainly was, because in fact, Price was not just a very clever scientist, he was also a fairly fanatical Christian. And actually, Price was disappointed with his own discovery, because Price wanted to find that there is no evolutionary basis for altruism, because therefore he could conclude that altruism is a pure gift from God, which makes no sense scientifically. Therefore, it can only come from God. So Price found out that there was a scientific basis for altruism, was so disappointed with this because it undermined God that he killed himself. So the sociobiologists are odd people. And Trivers, who I'm going to talk about a bit more now, was equally odd, though in different ways. He's still about, he's still odd. I've read his autobiography, which is one of the most bizarre things I've ever read. But whilst a lot of sociobiologists tend towards to lean to the political right, Trivers is not straightforward in that sense. In fact, Trivers was a great pal to what's his name? Huey P. Newton of the Black Panther Party, and Trivers actually joined the Black Panther Party. He left it again in the 1980s, but he wrote it, and Newton was the leader of the Black Panther Party in the United States. And actually Trivers and Newton wrote a scholarly article together. So Trivers himself is politically a little bit hard to place, but clearly in the left in some respects. but quite an eccentric in many regards. But Trivers is interesting to us for this argument because of what he came up with along with another guy called Willard, what's known as the parental investment theory. Now, the parental investment theory says this, that the male of the species can invest very little in reproduction of his genes, no more than sperm in essence, whilst women invest very heavily in reproduction of genes. So basically, the male of the species can spread around sperm, doesn't cost them very much. Women, on the other hand, have a huge bodily investment in reproduction. That is, they gestate, they labor, they give birth. And this, Trivers argues, gives rise to a certain divergence of interest between the sexes. There's no physiological limit to the male spreading his genes other than the number of partners he can find. In theory, therefore, for the male of the species, a strategy of promiscuity is a very attractive way to reproduce your genes, and therefore should be selected for. The psychology of promiscuity on the part of the male should be selected for by evolution. Women, on the other hand, have a pretty tight upper limit on how many children they can reasonably give birth to. My mother gave birth to 9 children, which is pretty much getting up to the upper limit of what you can practically do in a life. Women invest a lot in gestation, giving birth, and so on. So the argument here is that women have an interest not in finding as many partners as possible, but in finding reliable partners who will contribute to realizing their investment, that is, will contribute heavily to raising a child or raising children. So in theory, but this parental investment theory, there's a difference of interest between the sexes. Men are promiscuous and have commitment issues. Women, on the other hand, want to find reliable, committed males who have lots of resources they can bring to the raising of children. Therefore, there's a tendency for women to look for relatively high status men, in the sense of men who can provide, if you like. Now, in practice, this parental investment theory, if we look at humans in the state of nature, if you like, there's all sorts of caveats we must bring to the table. The main caveat I'd bring to the table is one I've already mentioned, that humans appear to be strongly pair bonding species. Not as much as some birds, which genuinely do pair bond for life. Humans don't quite do that. But compared to a lot of other primates, humans in all societies we know about, and we know about numerous hunter-gatherer societies, tend strongly towards pair bonding. Therefore, in the state of nature, it is not the case that men are running around being promiscuous and ignoring their children. Rather, in the state of nature, the family appears to be natural, that men and women both contribute quite strongly to the raising of children. Nonetheless, this is not to say that a certain divergence of interest doesn't exist in the terms of parental investment theory. That there is, even though there's not a sharp division between men and women in terms of what the biologists call dimorphism. Dimorphism is a measure of how large a difference there is between the male and the female. There's a very large difference, for example, between the peacock and the peahen. There isn't that much difference between the human male and the human female. It's doubtful that a Martian would notice much difference at all. In the state of nature, therefore, there is a certain dimorphic divergence in the interests of men and women along the lines of parental investment theory, but it's not very marked. Fundamentally, men and women tend towards pair bonding for the raising of children. However, there is something to build upon, and what I'd suggest is that once you introduce structured inequality, that is class society backed up by force, then sexual dimorphism, a difference of sexual behavior, can unnaturally run wild. So to put it this way, once you have a section of society monopolizing the surplus product, you have a situation where the males of this upper class are now in a situation where they have a status which makes them extremely valuable and attractive as partners. And they also have the power to coerce others into undertaking the parental role. So it's very easy for them to get partners. It's very easy for them to avoid any burdens of any parental burdens they're not that interested in. So when you have a structured class-divided society, you have a tendency for the males of the upper class to throw the burden onto women and lower class males, in the sense that women should act as mothers to raise their children. Men should act as providers for children, regardless of the paternity of those children. And this, an example of this is the semi-legendary, though it did happen or did exist, the droit de seigneur, the right of the landlord, for example, to deflower, as he used to say, to have sex with a bride on her on the day of her marriage. But that leaves no obligations for that landlord to have any parental role with any children which are produced. Rather, it's the male who is married, the lower class male who is married to the lower class female is obliged to provide for the children. The lower class female is obliged to mother that child. So the argument here is that with the limited tendency towards a kind of promiscuity and commitment issues on the part of men runs wild for upper class men when they have access to control over the surplus produce of a society. And the form this runs wild in is, in essence, patriarchy. That is, marriage is sacrosanct. There's a sexual division of duties. Women of the upper class have an interest in securing the resources of that class for their children. And this means they also have an interest in forcibly excluding lower class women from any claim on the resources of the wealthy. Therefore, lower class women should get married to people of their own class. They should stay married and they should stay well out of the way. They should not attract the attention of the wealthy of the upper class. And so we have here actually upper class women also have a certain interest in patriarchy, the sacrosanct nature of marriage, the sexual division of duty, a patriarchy as we come to know it. And so the argument I've been suggesting here in the introduction to the paper, quite long introduction to the paper, is that we might understand patriarchy as something which does have a certain connection to the natural dimorphism of humans, differences between male and female, but is fundamentally unnatural because it's a dimorphism which is run wild. And it's a dimorphism which is reliant upon extreme class divisions. Therefore, it's class society which gives rise to patriarchy. Patriarchy, of course, then developing its own ideological and cultural autonomy. But in some respects, what do you call them? I've forgotten the name of the guy I was going to accuse. So we'll leave that. Okay, so that's kind of an introduction on certain theoretical points. I want to come now to the middle of the 19th century, the period of Marx and Engels, and discussions of and how patriarchy, if we use that term, was understood. In some respects, we can see the classical origins of bourgeois feminism in the writings and activities of John Stuart Mill, who wrote The Subjection of Women in 1869, written jointly with Harriet Taylor Mill. Now, subjection is a key term here. subjection is not exploitation. And indeed, the argument what John Stuart Mill is attacking is fundamentally the subjection of middle-class women and indeed upper-class women by middle-class men and upper-class men. and in this bourgeois ideal of separate spheres, the women are not actually exploited because women are not supposed to do anything productive. They don't even really play much of a role in the raising of children. An awful lot of that is left to the servants. That fundamentally, what Mill is attacking is the subjection of women. That is, men being able to dominate over women, not in order to exploit them, because in the middle class ideal, women are not exploited. They are left to sit passively at home, being served and not doing anything very useful, but they're under the control of men. So subjection is about the domination of men by women. It's described by Mill in The Subjection of Women as the possession of power, and Mill doesn't have objections to that in principle. What he does have objection to is power here, which is not confined to a limited class, but is common to the whole male sex. And he points out the horror of it, that even the clodhopper, that is the peasant, exercises his share of power equally with the highest noblemen. So in this sense, subjection of women is about the domination of men over women. It is distinct from class divisions. And therefore, the correction of the excessive subjection of women, as Mill sees it, is not something which requires any change in the class nature of society. The famous petition and amendments that Mill introduced when he was a member of Parliament in 1866 and 1867, for example, demanded the suffrage for women on the ground of existing property qualifications. That is, you could only have the vote if you were fairly well off. Women should have the vote, but only if they were fairly well off. That is, the class privileges of society should not be touched. It's simply that women of a particular class status should have access to the same privileges as men of their class. And so the petition, which is introduced, began with these words, that it having been expressly laid down by high authorities that the possession of property in this country carries with it the right to vote, ... on it goes, women should have the vote on the same basis. Now, if we look at the kind of Marxian interpretation of the sex question, if you like, a patriarchy has got a rather different meaning, because here exploitation is crucial to the way Marx talks about patriarchy. That is, patriarchy is the organization and exploitation of extended family labor, that is, wife, children, servants, and apprentices, which makes up the wider concept of the family, by the male head of the household. And fundamentally, Marx saw this kind of patriarchal exploitation of the family by the head of the household as something which is characteristic of peasant economy and characteristic of petty bourgeois economy. In that sense, even when Marx is writing the Communist Manifesto, he is arguing that patriarchy based upon the exploitation of the family by the head of the family is actually being undermined. It's not something which will be undermined in the future. It is being undermined in the present by capitalism, because capitalism is undermining the petty bourgeois household. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial proletariat. The family is being disintegrated, Marx argued, by modern industry. And this undermines a patriarchy which is based not simply upon subjection of the family by the patriarch, but is based upon the exploitation of family labor by the patriarch. And Clara Zetkin, later on, perhaps the leading theorist of the Second International on the women question and in the early Communist International, makes the similar argument capitalist production has relegated the good old days of the economic housewife to the old parlour. Working women, above all wage-earning women, are now at the heart of the economy. So the argument here is that patriarchal exploitation is being undermined in the present by capitalism. In connection with this, it's worth just looking briefly at the anarchist tradition, particularly that which comes from Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon, one of the original kind of anarchist theorists, was very much in favor of small-scale independent production. And because of this, he positively approved of patriarchy and disapproved of women's emancipation, which he feared undermined small-scale private property, or small-scale family property, and which only benefited large-scale capitalism. So Proudhon is basically an anti-feminist anarchist. It's not the case that all anarchism thereafter is anti-feminist, but in fact you do have quite a strong trend of anarchist anti-feminism arising out of this Proudhon tradition. Now, what actually was the bourgeois feminist movement doing in the second half of the 19th century? Well, the primary goal of the bourgeois women's movement was the removal of restrictions on women who wished to enter the professions. That's fundamentally what they focused upon. Professions such as teaching, professions such as medicine, professions indeed such as acting, things like that. These are the kinds of jobs that the first wave of feminist activists in the 19th century tended to focus upon. And they wanted to remove restrictions on women entering these professions and in advancing these within these professions. That's the first goal they look to, and they develop eventually, a bit cautiously at first, but they develop the idea that the best way to advance these interests is to have women win the vote on the same basis as men have the vote in whatever society these bourgeois women happen to be operating. Now, the bourgeois feminist movement probably predates somewhat as a large-scale movement the socialist movement. If we date the socialist movement becoming large-scale by let's say the late 1880s, 1890s, bourgeois feminism is a little bit earlier than that, but they do coincide to a large extent. And as a rule, the bourgeois women's movement was anxious not to be closely associated with the workers' movement. They felt that, if nothing else, that they were being subversive enough, and they didn't want to complicate the issue by associating with the workers' movement, which is looked upon as a danger to a well-ordered society. And so I just got a quotation here on the PowerPoint from a fairly middle-class German socialist, Therese Schlesinger, who recalled her getting involved in the General Austrian Women's Association, a bourgeois feminist movement, which had been formed in 1893. She goes along to the first International Women's Congress, Bourgeois Feminist Congress, which took place in Berlin in the late summer of 1896. It had been organized by bourgeois women, but she was sent as a delegate of the German Austrian Women's Association. She began giving a report, and it all went very well, but she herself is a socialist, so about halfway through her report, she turns to the subject of the Social Democratic Women's Movement and the Women Workers newspaper. At this point, the chairwoman of the Congress suddenly jumps up and tells her that she's run out of time. And now Schlesinger had noted that speakers before her had spoken much longer than she had spoken. As all these situations, you can never quite be sure why you've been told to shut up. But you saw in this action from the chairperson, whether I was right or not doesn't matter, an anti-working class bias. And this is pretty typical. The bourgeois feminist movement wanted to keep at least arm's length distance from the female workers' movement. So what was bourgeois about the bourgeois women's movement? First of all, in most countries, those who are involved in the feminist movement, the women's movement as such, did tend to come from a bourgeois background. And there are a good number of these women. So just giving some statistics from about 1901, if you're taking into account a wage-earning woman, and these are the kinds of women who tended to be involved in the bourgeois women's movement. If you're talking about bookkeepers, teachers, writers, scholars, physicians, artists, actresses, and so forth, there's about 190,000 in Germany, 61,000 in Austria, 220,000 in France, 269,000 in England, so on. And these are people who had already made their way into the professions, but felt constrained in the professions and wished to advance the rights and the opportunities for women within the professions. Now, in opposing, in wishing to advance their own sex within the professions, the bourgeois women's movement were generally opposed in the 19th century to what is known as protective legislation. And protective legislation restricted women's entry into certain jobs. And the bourgeois women's movement opposed this protective legislation as seeing it as the thin edge of the wedge. Because what protective legislation said is that there are certain jobs that women are not appropriate. It's not appropriate for women to work in these jobs. And up until about 1880s, the bourgeois women's movement was fundamentally opposed to all protective legislation. And this included the great majority of factory acts, that is protective legislation, which had been introduced to limit exploitation in the workforce. And these factory acts almost always prioritized the protection of women and children. Bourgeois feminists were opposed to this kind of legislation because it is telling women that they are relatively incapable compared to men. From the late 1880s into 1890s, however, bourgeois feminism, you can begin to see a bit of a growing split within bourgeois feminism between, on the one hand, equal rights feminism, which basically says there's no difference between men and women, therefore there should be no protective legislation because women don't need special protection. Against this, you begin to see the emergence of what's called social feminism. That is a kind of feminism which does say that, well, there are particular interests that women have in the workplace which do require protection. So the bourgeois women's movement in its origins and for much of its development was opposed to the kind of protective legislation which was a principal goal for the trade union movement specifically and the worker movement in general. Secondly, the bourgeois women's movement in practice relied a lot upon domestic service. For a lot of these women involved in either working in the professions or indeed in campaigning, they relied a certain freedom from the domination of domestic work at home, and therefore they relied upon domestic service. The domestic service was dominated by proletarian and peasant women, and it was domestic service which allowed professional women and suffrage activists to escape from domestic duties. And so this certainly led to an ongoing tension within the bourgeois women's movement, which is known at the time as the servant problem. This servant problem is just huge in the late 19th, early 20th century. There's just a huge amount written about how you can't get good servants anymore. And I just give a quote from a woman writing to, presumably a woman servant writing to a suffrage newspaper in Britain in 1911. Why don't the suffragists begin their reform work at home? Why don't they try in some way to relieve the monotonous life of the domestic servant? If they want equality of men, why cannot they put servants in 12 hours a day shift like the majority of workmen? Okay, so that's kind of what bourgeois feminism looks like. I just want to have a little bit of a look at Adelaide Popp, who is an Austrian a factory worker, woman factory worker. He went on to become an agitator for the Socialist Party, and she wrote an interesting autobiography. And how she becomes involved in the movement tells us something about what it was like for women getting involved in the socialist movement in this period. So she turns up at a socialist meeting, finds, first of all, that she's the only woman there. Everybody turns around, looks at her in astonishment. She went to a second meeting, which is held on Christmas Day. They're pretty dedicated in those days, at which there are 2 women present. Still very timid. She didn't even have the courage, she says, to applaud the speech, and she considered doing so to be unwomanly, only right for the men. The men did all the talking. The third meeting she goes to was an election meeting. In Austria, and you had similar legislation in a lot of countries, women were not allowed to go to election meetings. They didn't have the vote. They weren't allowed to be there. However, she wanted to be there, so the organizers allowed her to stand at the back in a corner. She gets more and more enthusiastic about what she hears. Finally, she decides to actually become a social democrat, to become a socialist, and in order to discuss politics. She began to go with her brothers and their wives to parties which she had formerly avoided. As she says herself, I wanted to have an opportunity of talking about social democracy, and was of the opinion that one could talk about politics better with men than with women. I only learnt later how much I had overestimated the political knowledge of men. So we just get a certain sense here about the barriers to female involvement in politics of any kind, including socialist politics, and how it's a kind of learning process of overcoming kind of patriarchal assumptions which are predominant in society and certainly not absent from the socialist movement. I want to turn now to a book by August Babel, the leader of the German SPD, Women and Socialism, published in 1879. He actually wrote it when he was in prison, but being in prison in the Bismarckian Reich, if you were a political prisoner, wasn't too bad. This tended to be the case in Europe in the late 19th century. If you were a political prisoner, you had a lot of privileges. You were allowed to read as many books as you liked. You're allowed to have as many visitors as you liked. And you had quite a lot of space and right of association. Outside somewhere like Russia, really the only country where political prisoners didn't have any rights which were distinct, which were superior to criminal prisoners, was the United Kingdom. So it was bad luck for the Fenians in British prisons who had no political rights at all. But political rights are pretty standard on the continent. And Babel, when he's in prison, sits down and writes Women and Socialism. This is an enormously successful book. I've got a copy at home from the early 20th century, which is the 50th edition of the book. Any book which goes to a 50th edition has done rather well. It's very widely read. It's one of the best read books produced by the Second International. Partly because people are interested in the women issue, partly I think also because it's one of the few books produced in the period of the Second International, which actually spends quite a lot of time looking in general terms at speculating in general terms on how a future socialist society might actually be organized. So I think people read this book not just because it's about women, but actually a lot of people read it because it's a rare example of coming up with recipes for the cook shops of the future, of actually hypothesizing about what a socialist society will look like. I don't know how well you can see it, but down in the corner there is a book, August Babel, The Society of the Future, which was published by Progress Publishers, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, in 1971. And that's actually an excerpt from Women and Socialism. Women and Socialism is interesting because it goes quite far in the direction of the bourgeois feminist argument that all women are oppressed by all men, and that this is a question of subjection, which is radically distinct from the question of class exploitation. And so Babel says, regardless of the question of whether woman is oppressed as a proletarian, we must recognize that she is oppressed as a sex being. On all sides, she is hemmed in by restrictions and obstacles unknown to men. All men subjugate women, and all rulers are resistant to reason. Women, therefore, can no more rely upon the aid of men than the workers can rely upon the aid of the bourgeoisie. So this is pretty striking. And this work owes a lot to Engels' writing in The Origins of Family, Private Property and the State. It owes a lot to the early utopian socialists of the 1820s and the 1830s. He'd written a lot about the women question. It owes rather less to the Communist Manifesto, because if you remember, the Communist Manifesto tends to see patriarchal exploitation of women as being an effect of pre-capitalist small-scale commodity production. Nonetheless, Babel's work doesn't accept the bourgeois feminist argument, which opposes all protective legislation. And indeed, Babel goes on to say that there should be limits to formal equality, in the sense that there are certain modes of work which he thought were inappropriate for women. It is certainly no pleasant sight to behold women, even pregnant women, working on the construction of railways and so on and so forth. Such work strips a woman of all womanliness and so on, turns the natural order upside down. So what's interesting about women in socialism is quite how far it goes in the direction of patriarchy being a radically distinct a form of subjection, which is distinct from exploitation, and that women have got, of all classes, have got interests in common. And women of all classes can put no reliance in men of any class. So Clara Zetkin, as indicated earlier, was the main theorist of the SPD and really of the Second International on women in general. And she always said that Babel's book was good, but I think actually she did have problems with it, though she tended not to be explicit about the problems. And her analysis, I think, is rather closer to the analysis which is in summary form presented in the Communist Manifesto. Now, she argues, she wants to argue what's the basis of the bourgeois feminist movement, which she says bourgeois women want to escape the doll's house existence. That is the boring existence, the pointless existence of living in a bourgeois household where you're not supposed to be useful in any way at all. Therefore, the bourgeois feminist movement wishes to escape the doll's house existence. This is a reference to a play by Ibsen. And we're looking for equal professional training and equal job opportunities for both sexes. This was resisted by bourgeois men who feared the competition. This in turn led to bourgeois women demanding political rights. What does she say about the bourgeois feminist movement? Well, she says the economic as well as the intellectual and moral endeavors of the bourgeois women's rights advocates are completely justified. So within their own terms, the bourgeois feminist movement is justified in what they're doing. However, she then goes on to say that the proletarian women are in a radically different situation, because proletarian women do not live in a doll's house, sitting at home. Proletarian women, to a substantial extent, already have gained economic independence as wage workers. Many of them are already in the workplace, out of the home, in the workplace, earning a wage. Therefore, they don't have the interest of bourgeois feminist movements, which is to break into professions. Proletarian wage workers are already, under force of necessity, working for wages in the workplace. But neither as a human being nor as a woman or wife has she the possibility to develop her individuality. Therefore, the liberation struggle of the proletarian woman cannot be similar to the struggle the bourgeois woman wages against the male of her class. The proletarian woman does not need to fight against the men of her class in order to tear down the barriers which have been raised against her participation in the free competition of the marketplace. On the contrary, for proletarian women, new barriers need to be erected against the exploitation of the proletarian woman. Her rights as a wife and mother need to be restored and permanently secured. Her final aim is not the free competition of men, but the achievement of the political rule of the proletariat. So the point here actually is this is an argument in favor of protective legislation for women and the defense of women from exploitation within the workplace. So whilst for the bourgeois feminist movement, they are reacting against subjection, the proletarian workers' movement, the women's movement, is primarily interested in resisting exploitation. Importantly, for Zetkin, it must certainly not be the task of socialist propaganda among socialist women to alienate the proletarian woman from her duties as mother and wife. So what Zetkin's suggesting here is that women do need protective legislation to allow them to carry out, the way she had put it, their sex being as mothers and secondarily as wives. Similar kind of argument is made by Lily Brown, who's kind of interesting. She comes herself from kind of bourgeois background. She had been involved in the bourgeois feminist movement, and from the bourgeois feminist movement ended up in the SPD, where she kind of rubs up against Zetkin, and she eventually leaves again. But she noted something which I think was happening in the late 19th, early 20th century, which is a certain coming together of the women's workers' movement and the bourgeois feminist movement. She makes a point in this extract that the women of the bourgeoisie had to fight for what the proletarian already had, access to the male professions. Proletarian women are already in the workplace. Bourgeois women had to fight to get out of the doll's house of the family home and to get into the workplace. For that reason, the women's movement begins as a bourgeois movement. It is also primarily an old maids movement, as she says, which gave it its peculiar character for a long time. She believes that this movement failed to recognize that there was a sex-specific interest in motherhood, which is more evident to the proletarian workers' movement, or the proletarian women's movement. The proletarian women's movement was much more conscious that exploitation in the workplace was making it difficult for them to carry out their duties and their rights as mothers and as wives. But you can see a certain convergence here between the two positions. What Brown is arguing is that both bourgeois feminism and proletarian feminism is beginning to converge upon a particular argument. The idea that they should not be seeking a mechanical principle of the equality of men and women, but rather that the manner and form of labour in all lines of work should be tailored to suit men and women in different ways. What they should be seeking is the adaptation of work conditions to the nature of women, not the adaptation of women to given work conditions. This has become more and more prevalent in the contemporary women's movement. And this is what I was indicating earlier, the rise of what is called social feminism, or what you might also call difference feminism. By the early 20th century, difference feminism has really become quite strong. Difference feminism is the argument that men and women are radically different in many respects, but society should equally accommodate the interests of men and women, and that the interests of men and women should be considered on equal level. And just pointing out here too, Alexandra Kollontai, and we can see here that Kollontai usually seen as kind of ultra radical in the women question, but it is interesting too that she clearly accepts difference feminism when she writes that the followers of historical materialism fully accept the natural specificities of each sex and demand only that each person, whether man or woman, have a real opportunity for the fullest and freest self-determination. Kollontai is kind of most famous for her kind of sexual liberationism, but it's interesting, she's actually more cautious about it, I think, that many people tend to suggest. There's probably no other question about which socialists themselves are so little in agreement as the question of marriage and the family. Kollontai was a radical critic of the bourgeois sexual and family morality, however, but she was actually rather uncomfortable about what is called free love. Free love really in the early 20th century meant divorce on demand. So not very problematic for us, but it was considered kind of problematic at the time. And Kollontai, who's associated with the free love end of the debate, nonetheless points out in 1909 the problems which are associated with it. The idea being that if you have divorce on demand, what you might expect to see is men abandoning their families and women and children sinking into destitution. And therefore, free love or divorce on demand is one of these fundamental, one of these demands which can only be properly realized when you've had the fundamental transformation of all productive relations. Now, what did working class women think about all of this? Well, obviously, working class women is a lot of people, so it's hard to generalize. But it is worth bearing in mind that this argument that women are in the workplace, which is made by people like Zetkin and Brown and so on, clearly has a lot of weight. By 1900, more than a third of all employees were women in Austria, Switzerland, Scandinavian countries, about 30% in Germany, France, Belgium, and Great Britain. So it's very considerable, and is and has been increasing for some time. It's also worth saying, however, that it flattens out, it plateaus at the end of the First World War, and if anything goes down, tends to drop below 1900 levels until the 1950s. So this is not a general trend of increasing female engagement in the paid workforce. If anything, it tends to flatten out in the interwar period. Now, socialists, as we've seen, had been arguing that the ultimate emancipation for women derives from the breaking down of the petty bourgeois family and their absorption into the workforce. We've already seen some hesitation about this argument in Zetkin and even in somebody like Kollontai. And it's certainly not an argument which was straightforwardly popular amongst working class women. Most working class women were in favor of the idea of the family wage. That is, one wage per family should be adequate. And that the breadwinner should, in general terms, be male. Now, this is not just simply due to lack of education or false consciousness. It was kind of rational in the context of the time. Pregnancy and childcare, particularly breastfeeding, meant that wage labour for women is often likely to be interrupted. If you're going to have one wage per family, there made a certain sense to have that family wage being earned by the male. Underemployment was a chronic part of the labour market in this period, and therefore, when women saw married women working, they tended to see, well, one family is getting two wages, which means another family is getting no wage. So there wasn't that kind of solidarity with a married woman in the workplace that you might expect. The ideal for many women was the family wage, that is one wage per family, and that wage should, in general terms, go to the man. And moreover, in the third point, most working class families saw a rational division of labour between the male going out to work for wages and the female carrying out domestic labour. It must be emphasised that in this period, domestic labour was very heavy indeed. This is before you had supermarkets, before you had vacuum cleaners, before you had washing machines and antibiotics. And therefore, domestic labour is very considerable indeed. Keeping your house tidy was not just a matter of having your house looking nice. It meant keeping it relatively free of germs, when germs could very easily kill you before antibiotics. Shopping was a big struggle when you were relying upon products being in season, where you had to travel long distances to go to various little different shops to pick up what you needed to keep the family together. So there was a certain, in working class conscious, there was a certain rationality in the idea that the ideal should be one family wage per family, and that one parent should be full time maintaining the household, maintaining the children, maintaining the household. On top of this, of course, was, and connected to this, was straightforward patriarchal ideology. Male workers were aware that, of course, that women were generally paid less than men, and they feared that if women entered masculine jobs, it would lead to a reduction of wages across the board. The inaugural Paris Congress of the International in 1889, the trade unions urged to admit women into their ranks and to secure equal wages for the same kind of work. Many male trade unionists unquestionably were resistant to this. Women did get organized in trade unions, but not at anything like the same level as men getting organized. This is largely because women usually left full-time employment once they married. And the largest single form of female employment was domestic service. And it's extremely, you couldn't really organize domestic servants in a trade union because they're under the eye of the mistress. So women were organized in trade unions, but at nothing like the same level of density as men. Finally, women were broadly considered to be amenable to conservative political appeals that championed the domestic ideology. Now, as you've seen, there's a certain convergence of both bourgeois feminism and working class feminism around what you might call the notion of social feminism. Therefore, the socialists raised the demand for a maximum 8-hour day for all workers, regardless of sex. So it's moving away from the notion of protective legislation for women in particular. But a protective legislation was still seen to be something which could be won most easily for women and children, but women in the first instance, which would then be the wedge which would allow the extension of protective legislation for all workers, both male and female. And so it's a quote from Lily Brown: the social democratic movement wisely recognized that a limitation of women's work time was easier to obtain from the ruling class and could then become the best point of departure for wide-ranging measures. So in practice, the workers' movement tended to call for protective legislation to protect women, but with the intention of spreading this legislation so that it protects workers of all kinds. So despite the rise of this social feminism and the rise of difference feminism, tensions with bourgeois feminism certainly remained. Socialists, not least, were inclined, sometimes in rather sexist language, to see women of the ruling class as particularly exploitative and idle. And then there is the specifics of the suffrage question. 1891, the Erfurt programme of the SPD demanded universal suffrage, including, of course, women's suffrage. From 1889, the beginning of the Second International, the Congresses supported universal suffrage, that is, suffrage for all men, all women, over a certain age. In contrast, if you look at the resolution adopted unanimously at the 6th Congress of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance in Stockholm in 1911, this asserted that women's suffrage societies do their best work when organized in a non-partisan manner. That is, they should not associate with any political party or movement, and that, of course, included the workers' movement. And this meant not only keeping free of political entanglements, but also it meant that it allowed the bourgeois feminist movement to call for the extension of the franchise on the same terms as it was already being exercised by men. That is, they were not seeking universal suffrage; they were seeking the extension of the franchise to women, at least on the basis as it already existed for men. Now, this is problematic for the socialists, who didn't want to see conservatism being strengthened by only propertied women being given the vote. Feminists, on their part, bourgeois feminists, did not consider it acceptable that that women should wait for universal suffrage, that is, the extension of the franchise to all men, before any woman could be considered for the vote. So we have a problem here. Bourgeois feminists are looking for at least the extension of the vote as it already exists for men to women. while socialists or the socialist women's movement is saying universal suffrage, that is, all women should get the vote at the same time as all men getting the vote. At the Stuttgart Congress of the Second International, 1907, a resolution committed the Congress to women's suffrage, adding that the socialist parties of all countries are required to fight vigorously for the introduction of universal female suffrage. So not the extension of existing suffrage to women on the same basis as it exists, if that basis is limited to the property, but a universal suffrage for men and women. Even this, however, was problematic for socialists organized particularly in Catholic countries, notably Austria, Belgium, France, Spain, and Italy. Here, very clearly, socialists did not prioritize the struggle for the female suffrage in any form. Emil van der Velde was indiscreet enough to say in 1911, he was the leader of the Socialist Party in Belgium, that women are not yet intellectually mature enough to be given political rights. And part of the basis of this was the reality that patriarchal conservatism did have a certain attraction for women, as Lily Brown pointed out in 1912. And she talks about the Catholic German Centre Party, which exerted a strong attraction for many and not just for the ignorant. This is because the Catholic Centre Party, being religious, was able to was able to say that the role of women in the household was not just was sacred, was to be valued because it was a part of the natural law laid down by God. And for many women, he felt that they had little choice, I suppose, but to work in a domestic sphere. They valued an ideology which said that the kind of work they did was valid, was something to be was praiseworthy, was something which is blessed by God. Britain's worth looking at briefly, partly because Britain is unusual in a European standard, because the women's movement, the bourgeois women's movement, is much bigger than it is in continental countries. It also included to a much larger working class element. We can see Emmeline Pankhurst, who gradually grew disillusioned with the suffragette movement, the existing women's suffrage movement, and she joins the militant, helps to establish the militant Women's Social and Political Union in 1905. Her eldest daughter, Christabel, along with a mill girl, Annie Kearney, were arrested for causing a disturbance. So you can see, particularly in East London, a lot of working class women get involved in the WSPU, which is broadly a bourgeois feminist movement, but extremely radical, militant one. The main objective of the WSPU was not to gain universal suffrage, but votes for women on the same basis as men. This clearly created problems for the British Labour movement. Only a third of men had the vote in parliamentary elections. Nonetheless, the Fabian Society representative at the Stuttgart Congress of the International said, "We are for full women's suffrage, that is universal suffrage, but are willing to accept the limited women's suffrage as a down payment." So the Fabian Society breaking away from the standard line of the International. As we know, the WSPU are treated very badly. The suffragettes are treated very badly by the forces of the state and by men in general, force feeding and all the rest of it. Labour MP George Lansbury actually resigned his popular seat, specifically in the issue of force feeding, and fought a by-election almost solely on the women question. He lost the seat, and he annoyed a lot of even the left of the party in doing that. Interesting note, in 1914, the WSPU switched to zealous support for the war effort, changed the name of the newspaper from the Suffragette to Britannia. Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst became Tories. The other daughter, Sylvia, became an early communist. The first woman elected to Parliament in the United Kingdom, Lady Astor, was a conservative on the very hard right of the party. I mentioned a bit earlier kind of attitudes of socialists in this period to bourgeois feminists, and you do see a certain variation, sometimes exceptionally hostile. And so it's an interesting quote from Rosa Luxemburg. Most of the bourgeois women who act like lionesses, an appropriate term, I suppose, today, in the struggle against male prerogatives, would trot like docile lambs into the camp of conservative and clerical reaction if they had the suffrage. And then she has a go at these idle, as she sees it, a bourgeois women who are nothing but parasites. So it's pretty vociferous attack. James Connolly is interesting because he's actually quite in some respects, he's quite conservative on the woman question and certainly the question of sexuality in the family. But James Connolly was unusual in the Second International in being quite so supportive of a radical bourgeois feminism. And he is very keen to see radical bourgeois feminists going around smashing windows and that kind of thing. And you can see from the quotation that one of the reasons he liked it is because he thought that bourgeois feminists in their radicalism could inspire and help to radicalize the proletarian masses. If the proletarian masses were not being sufficiently radical, then they might be inspired by bourgeois feminists with their radicalism. I suspect this attitude of Connolly in 1915 may have some relation to why he participated in 1916. Having been rather disillusioned with the Irish working class, he looks to the kind of petty bourgeois nationalists of the 1916 rebellion, who by their militancy and sacrifice, he hopes will reignite a radicalism in the proletariat. Now, it's worth bearing in mind, even though we talked about bourgeois feminism, that it's certainly the case that socialists, in pure numerical terms, organized more women than the bourgeois feminists did, at least in continental Europe by the 20th century. Ellen Key, who is a difference feminist, sorry, not different, a difference feminist, who is quite popular with the socialists, though she wasn't a socialist herself, wrote that through socialism, feminism has penetrated to the masses. What the middle class women movement would have needed another century to effect, socialism has accomplished in a few decades. That's probably true. It's at the Copenhagen Congress of 1911 that International Women's Day was inaugurated. Now, of course, the women's workers' movement, like the workers' movement in general, is hit hard by the crisis of the outbreak of the First World War. Zetkin, who gravitates towards the radical left, he feels that actually it's easier for women to begin to criticize the war than it is for men, and therefore she is proud that it's the privilege as well as the duty of the socialist women's movement to begin the battle for peace and to arouse and lead the women of all classes and countries. It must be said, most feminists in 1914 and the years afterwards adopt a kind of maternalist feminism, which sees the role of women was to contribute to the military fitness of the nation. And I quote one bourgeois feminist in Germany, Gertrude Baumer, we mustn't ever forget that it is not just military training that is being put to the test in the trenches and at sea and so on, but also German mothers' upbringing and German wives' care. It's true that in the German turnip winter of 1916 to 17, women were to the fore in bread riots, as they were in the Russian Revolution of 1917, that should be, obviously. But it is striking quite how many bourgeois women gravitate at least to the conservative right, and in not a few cases towards fascism in the interwar period, on the basis of this kind of a difference feminism and maternalistic feminism. So, in the immediate aftermath of the war, we see in a lot of countries, though by no means all countries in Europe, the introduction of a universal suffrage, which includes a female suffrage. This has relatively little effect on the composition of parliaments in the first instance, but it is notable that the first minister, the first woman minister in Europe, is indeed a socialist, Countess Markievicz, rather eccentric socialist. He'd been a member of James Connolly's Irish Citizen Army and becomes a first minister in a democratically elected cabinet, that of Irish Dáil Éireann, elected in 1918. The Soviet Union, as we know, granted substantial social rights, divorce, abortion, equal wages, and so on. Lenin remained convinced, however, kind of going back to the Communist Manifesto line, that the fundamental basis of patriarchy was the small-scale domestic economy, the petty bourgeois, fundamentally the peasant domestic economy. Notwithstanding all the laws emancipating women, she'll still be a domestic slave because petty housework crushes her, stifles, degrades her, chains her to the kitchen, and that therefore the emancipation from housework means the emancipation into the wage-earning workforce. The main drag on women's rights, but in this sense, therefore, is that bastion of backwardness, the peasant economy. And I think the communist hostility to the patriarchal peasant mode of production, something very deeply ingrained, was a factor in the forced collectivization of agriculture in 1928 to 30. So in conclusion, much of the literature you'll read about socialism and feminism in this period tends to emphasize, and I think rather overemphasize, the ingrained sexist attitudes of the socialist movement to explain its attitude towards the women's movement. It's based upon a certain truth, but I think it understates the degree to which the socialist movement was in the vanguard in supporting women's rights. And it does tend to elide that middle-class interests were dominant in first wave feminism. It's also worth bearing in mind that working and middle-class women generally accepted the sexual division of labour in this time. This is partly due to the ideological influence of sexism, but it should also be seen, I think, as women with their own agency responding to the rational labour market conditions which existed at the time.